Before you start lecturing me like my dad would, yes, I know it's dangerous for anyone, especially a woman my age, to walk home alone at night. Trust me, I'm fully aware. But here's the thing. My neighborhood has always felt ridiculously safe. The kind of place where people don't lie awake, wondering if they remembered to lock the door. I can't tell you how many times I've stumbled home and discovered my keys still hanging in the lock the next morning. That sense of safety has changed over the past few months. There's a knife-wielding killer on the loose, attacking people at random. The victims are found brutally stabbed, sometimes just steps from their own front doors. It's happening so frequently that we're pretty sure it's a serial killer. Before all this, I used to walk home at night without a second thought. I don't have a car, can't afford one yet, and the public transportation here is awful, so I'd make do on foot. But now it's a little different. Last night was the worst timing possible. I wasn't even leaving work. Lately, I've been careful in carpooling with my coworkers, especially after noticing that a lot of these attacks have happened on nights I'd normally be heading home. But last night, I'd had a major blowout with my boyfriend, well, ex-boyfriend now. We fought for over an hour, and he ended up breaking my phone before kicking me out. He was drunk and raging about my not texting back fast enough. Never mind that it was usually the middle of the night, and I was either asleep or bartending. By the time I got outside, buses weren't running, and I had no money for a cab even if I could have called one. So I decided to walk. I tried convincing myself it was no big deal. 15 minutes, that's it, right? No. But I couldn't ignore the fact there's a killer on the streets, especially one who doesn't seem to have a specific target. Some murderers go after a certain type, maybe only women or people who resemble someone they hate. But this guy doesn't care. Men, women, young, old. He just kills because he wants to, and that's terrifying. Still, I pushed forward, telling myself I'd be quick. I used to love walking at night, how quiet the town was, like I had the world to myself. But now it felt like I wasn't alone at all. I kept thinking it was just me and him out there. Me, the potential victim, and him, the hunter. At first, I managed to keep calm by reminding myself we hadn't had a new killing in a couple of weeks. I tried to stay alert, listening for any noise, and that's probably why I heard something behind me. My head snapped around before I could even think about it. Sure enough, there was a man in black a little ways back, walking fast in my direction. I decided not to stick around to find out his intentions. I picked up the pace. My feet were killing me, but I had no choice. I was only a few blocks from home. I could hear his footsteps picking up speed too. I risked a quick look back, and of course, I tripped like some cliché horror movie scene. My hands slapped the pavement, and I knew I had to scramble up immediately because his footsteps were getting louder. He was running. What happened next is a blur. My adrenaline took over, and I just remember trying to get away, feeling like I was running on autopilot. Then, the next thing I knew, I woke up in my own bed this morning, hungover, sore, and a little scraped up, but alive. My phone was destroyed, so I jumped on my laptop and saw the news. Someone had been found dead on the same street I ran down, probably around the same time I was there. The report said the body was so badly injured they weren't sure how long an ID would take. I'm not totally clear on what went down after I tripped, but I'm still here. A few bruises and scratches are all I've got to show for it, and I'm beyond grateful for that. It's crazy how close I came to something awful, but I survived. And honestly, that's all that matters right now. Back when I was 22, I'd just come home from stocking shelves at the grocery store until midnight. I lived in a less than great neighborhood with my roommate Mark, but I was just happy not to be crashing in my parents' basement. Anyway, I walked in, dropped my jacket by the door, and headed to the kitchen to grab a late-night snack. As I passed the hallway, I noticed my bedroom door was slightly open, even though I could have sworn I closed it before leaving for work. I called out, "Hello, Mark?" No answer. Mark's kind of a prankster, so I figured he might be messing with me. When I peered into my room, everything looked normal, so I shrugged it off and went back to microwave my burrito. That's when I heard a thump from down the hall. At first, I chalked it up to loud neighbors, but then I heard it again, closer. Right then, my microwave beeped, practically giving me a heart attack. Suddenly, I heard Mark's voice yell something about dropping something. I felt relieved, until I got a text from Mark asking me to leave the door unlocked because he was running late at work. In other words, he wasn't actually home. My stomach dropped. I looked down the hall and saw a tall figure holding what looked like a butcher knife. I didn't wait around. I bolted for the front door, hearing heavy footsteps behind me. He wasn't running, just following me at a steady pace. I raced down the stairs and called the cops from the parking lot. They arrived fast and searched the place. Nobody was there. But on the kitchen table, weighed down by a salt shaker, was a single note with one word on it. Soon. Growing up with a single mom who worked 12-hour shifts at the local nursing facility meant nights at home were usually loud and chaotic. But every so often, Mom would dress up in a fancy gown and head out on a date, leaving me with a quick kiss on the forehead, a perfect lipstick print, and the promise of a quiet evening. Those nights were rare, though, because most of the time she'd come home exhausted, watch TV at a ridiculous volume, and wind up arguing with us kids over trivial stuff. This particular night felt like a miracle. Everyone had plans, so I'd have the entire house to myself for about 5 hours. Complete, uninterrupted alone time. I piled my stash of snacks on my bed, opened up our shared laptop, and tried to decide what fun thing to do first. I ended up choosing a scary movie, turning off all the lights for extra atmosphere. I was maybe half an hour into the film when I heard snickering from somewhere outside my room. At first, I assumed it was part of the movie, but hitting pause made it clear it was coming from the hallway, or maybe the kitchen. I froze. My siblings weren't supposed to be back yet. It could have been a neighbor's kid, but I wasn't taking any risks. I glanced around for a weapon, but my room was child-proofed for my younger sisters, so all I found was a heavy sports trophy. Better than nothing. The laughter started getting louder, sounding strangely excited, like someone who's winning at hide and seek but can't hold in their giggles. Then I heard what sounded like chairs scraping across the floor, and some kind of wet, messy noise, like someone was ripping apart food. It was gross, and definitely not normal. My mind raced with terrible possibilities, and I was too scared to just walk out there. My phone was downstairs, so I crept over to the laptop, typed out a desperate plea for help via email and social media, and waited. It felt like forever, but eventually I heard a car in the driveway. Not the cops, though. There was a mad scramble, keys rattling in the front door, and then total chaos. My sister screamed at the top of her lungs and bolted back outside. The laughter got even louder before disappearing, and when I finally peeked out the window, I saw her running one way, while a naked man covered in what had to be blood ran the other. He was howling with laughter until he vanished from sight. Neighbors started crowding around the front yard, and the police arrived soon after. Lights flashed, officers rushed in, and I heard horrible gagging sounds downstairs. One of them finally called out to me. A female officer led me downstairs, telling me to keep my eyes closed. Of course, I tried to sneak a look, and that's when I saw enough to make me faint. In the aftermath, I learned I'd been in my room for nearly an hour while my mother was attacked and killed in the kitchen. Her attacker, someone connected to that nursing facility apparently, fled back to his room there and was still laughing when the police took him away. He kept laughing through all the court hearings, right up until his sentence came down. I don't think he'll ever laugh again. Neither will my mother. Back when I was a broke university student, I had to live at home with my parents and 4 siblings. My parents took them all on a week-long trip to France, leaving me behind in the middle of exam season. I was thrilled to have the house to myself, until everything got weird. On Tuesday night, around 7 p.m., I was driving home on this dark road that leads to our street. Out of nowhere, I saw this pale, bald guy walking along, shirtless, carrying a shovel. We don't live anywhere near a farm, so I had no clue why he'd need a shovel at that hour. He had these eerie, empty eyes that made my stomach drop. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe he was lost or had dementia. I had enough to worry about with my exams. By Wednesday, I'd almost forgotten about the guy. I was busy studying music theory at home and practicing piano, so I didn't notice time passing until it was already dusk. I went outside to grab some clothes from the line when I heard movement near the driveway bushes. I froze and asked who was there, but got silence in return. After standing there forever, I eventually crept back inside, locking the door behind me. I felt shaky, but tried to brush it off. Thursday rolled around, and after an evening of piano practice, I headed to the kitchen to make a sandwich. That's when I heard a high, singular note from the piano, like someone hit one key and let it ring out. My heart sank. Our house has a motion detector panel with lights for different rooms, and I saw the light for the piano room blinking, along with the one for the room I was in. Then the piano room light went off and the hallway light started flashing. Next thing I knew, I heard footsteps running. I grabbed a kitchen knife and bolted into a bedroom, hiding under the bed. The intruder came in, and I could see his legs from my vantage point. He paused, then moved toward the closet. Luckily, he left the room without finding me. It was now or never, so I slipped out, trying to reach the front door. I made a noise on the last stair, and the footsteps came rushing after me. I managed to unlock the door, run outside, and scream for help. The cops arrived fast, but found no sign of anyone in the house or the neighborhood. After hearing the description, one neighbor mentioned it might match a guy who'd lived nearby before going missing 6 months back. The police kept an eye on my street for the rest of the week, but nothing else happened. Even though I've moved out since then, I can't shake the image of that pale man with the shovel. And anytime I come home late, I still double-check every corner just to be safe. I remember it all so clearly, even though it happened a few years ago when I was just 15, a sophomore in high school. It was a Friday night in November, that time of year when the air is cold enough that you can see your breath in front of your face, and the first dustings of snow start drifting down. My parents had decided to go out for a rare night to themselves. They always stayed out late when they did this, sometimes well past midnight, almost till dawn. My 9-year-old brother wasn't around either. He'd gone to a friend's house for a sleepover, so I ended up staying home alone, which wasn't usually a big deal. I liked the quiet, and we lived in a pretty calm neighborhood. At least, that's what I told myself. But let me back up and describe where I live. My house sits right on the edge between a small suburban area and a more rural one. It's in Texas, so you can imagine the wide open fields and clusters of forest. Directly across from my house, there's a thick patch of trees leading into a field beyond. There are only a few neighbors nearby, an older couple to one side, who typically have their kids and grandkids visiting on weekends. They were apparently quiet that evening. On the other side is a middle-aged couple that works overnight shifts, so they were gone too. Another neighbor lives diagonally across from me, far down the road to the left, and they have a sweet 4-year-old kid who sometimes plays with my brother and me. But aside from these neighbors, the area is pretty desolate, especially at night. I could step out onto the porch and see nothing but darkness, the beam of the occasional street lamp flickering in the distance, and the silhouettes of bare trees against the winter sky. That Friday, I felt tired and a bit lazy, but it was nice to have the house to myself. I made some rice and chicken for dinner, poured myself a glass of soda, and settled on the couch to play some Halo on my Xbox. It's such a great way to zone out and pass the time. The snow was starting to come down outside, but it was a gentle, peaceful fall. Nothing crazy or blizzard-like. Just big, soft flakes drifting onto the ground. By around 11 p.m., I was deep into a match, eyes glued to the screen, when I got the weirdest feeling. It was like a nagging in my stomach telling me something was off. At first, I brushed it aside. I figured it was because I was alone in the house, and sometimes your imagination just goes wild when you're by yourself. I shook my head and tried to refocus on the game. Then, just as I was forgetting that uneasy feeling, smack, smack, smack. The sound was so sudden and distinct that for a second I thought it might be coming from the game. But it was too loud, too real, like someone was literally hitting something against glass. Fear rippled through me. I turned around toward the large window above the couch, right behind me. My heart was pounding. Slowly, I lifted the blinds. Nothing. Just swirling snow, the quiet yard, and the dark outline of the forest across the street. Everything looked totally normal, which only made it feel more disturbing. I tried telling myself that maybe a branch fell from a tree, or a clump of snow slid off the roof and whacked the window on its way down. The logic wasn't perfect, but sometimes you just want to cling to the mundane explanation. Still, that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. My imagination was running overtime with possibilities of what could be out there. To calm my nerves, I told myself I'd just go into our home office for a while. Maybe watch some YouTube videos, listen to music, or, like any teenage kid left alone, pull up some adult content to distract myself. I'm not proud of it, but anything to get my mind off that creepy sound, right? That worked for about 30 minutes. For a little while, I felt relaxed again, thinking I'd simply overreacted. I was halfway into a video, starting to convince myself that the earlier sound was just some freak occurrence, and then it happened again. Womp, womp, womp. This time it came from the office window to my right. It was so purposeful, like a steady pounding from someone's fist or some heavy object. My stomach twisted, and fear burned in my throat. I knew in my gut this wasn't random. This had to be a person or something deliberately hitting the house. My brain jumped into overdrive. I flew out of the office chair and sprinted to the kitchen. I grabbed the biggest flashlight we own, plus one of those large kitchen knives. I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. Part of me wanted to shout, "Who's there?" But another part of me thought that would only make things worse. With my flashlight shining ahead of me, I walked back toward the office. I forced myself to peek through the window at the yard. At first glance, it looked empty. No figure standing there. No movement among the trees. But then I noticed faint footprints in the thin layer of snow, stretching from the window to the tree line. I didn't see any sign of who might have made them, but it was proof that someone or something had definitely been up against the house. My heart was hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. I never thought of myself as a scaredy cat, but in that moment, I felt so completely alone. It's weird how your mind starts racing, imagining every possible scenario. Like maybe it's a burglar, or some twisted person who gets a thrill out of terrorizing people in the dark. I picked up my phone and called my mom. It rang a few times, and I was afraid they wouldn't answer. But thankfully, she picked up. I tried to keep my voice steady as I described what happened. I told her about the banging noises and the footprints. I could practically hear the tension in her voice, even though she tried to stay calm. She said, "Lock the doors. If it happens again, call the cops. Be safe, okay?" She and my dad were nearly an hour and a half away. They offered to come home right away, but I knew they rarely got these moments to themselves, and I felt guilty ruining it. I told them I'd be all right. Maybe it was no big deal, but I did exactly what she told me. I ran around the house, locked the doors, made sure every window was latched, and then hurried upstairs to my bedroom, still clinging to the flashlight and that big knife. There's a weird sense of safety you get when you're in your own room, like it's your little fortress. I flopped onto my bed, plugged in my earbuds, and tried to drown out my fear with some music. Queen was my go-to that night. I mean, how can you be scared listening to Freddie Mercury, right? I tried shutting my eyes, hoping that maybe I could drift to sleep and forget about this madness. But after maybe 10 minutes, I realized I was straining to hear something over the music. I pulled out one earbud and paused. My body tensed. Whack, whack, whack. My blood turned cold. It was even louder this time, and it sounded like it was coming from somewhere downstairs, maybe another window, or the side door. I froze, too terrified to check. My mind cycled through every horror movie scenario I'd ever seen, but after a moment, the sound stopped. Everything was silent again, which was somehow even scarier. I reached for my phone and called my parents one more time. By then, it was probably around 2 a.m., and they told me they were on their way, speeding back as fast as they could. Those next 45 minutes were the longest of my life. Every tiny noise in the house made me jump. I stared at the bedroom door, half expecting it to burst open any second. But nothing else happened. Just the occasional creaking and settling of the house, or the wind outside brushing against the siding. Finally, I saw headlights flash across my window, and I heard the front door unlocking. My parents were home. I can't describe the relief that washed over me when I heard their voices calling my name. By the time they arrived, it was close to 3 a.m., and I was a total mess. Shaky, exhausted, but so glad they were there. I told them everything in detail. The 2 sets of knocks, the footprints, and how I saw nobody. My dad, who'd been in the military years ago, immediately went into protective mode. He retrieved his handgun from the safe, and we went outside to investigate. The snow was a couple of inches deep by this point, so any footprints would be fairly obvious. Under the glow of our flashlights, we saw fresh prints circling around our house multiple times. They'd pause at the windows, almost like whoever it was had been peering in. Then they led over to the side door. My dad shone his light onto the wood, and we could see it had been battered. The center of the door was splintered, as though struck with something heavy, like a hammer or a mallet. That was all the confirmation we needed that this was no random weather event. Someone had been intentionally trying to scare me, or worse, all night. My mom was shaking her head in disbelief. She'd assumed maybe I was overreacting, but now she saw the evidence right there in the twisted wood. None of us slept that night. We stayed in the living room, my dad's gun on the coffee table, all the lights on as we talked about what to do. We debated calling the police, but ironically, it was so late and so little had actually happened besides property damage that we decided to wait until morning. Just as dawn was lighting up the sky, my dad finally decided to check the forest for clues. I stayed behind with Mom. I remember watching him from the window, trudging through the snow toward that cluster of trees, my breath fogging up the glass. Every minute he was gone, I was a bundle of nerves, terrified he'd run into someone or find something worse than footprints. Eventually, he came back, looking pale and shaken. He told us he'd followed the footprints deeper into the trees, where they ended at a makeshift shelter, like a shabby lean-to someone might build if they were camping or squatting out there. Inside, my dad found a bunch of photographs of our house, snapshots from different angles, some during the day, some at night. He also found a small sledgehammer with bits of wood jammed onto the metal head, which had to be from the pounding on our door. The footprints then continued out of the shelter and cut across the field, heading toward a distant road. Whoever was out there probably left on foot, either that or they had a car waiting down the way. We called the police in the morning, and they came out to look at everything. They asked us some questions, but didn't really find any solid leads on who might have done it. The old couple next door hadn't seen anything, and the middle-aged neighbors were gone at work, so they had nothing to add. Meanwhile, I was left with a sense of complete violation. It's one thing to imagine random knocks. It's another to discover that somebody was actually lurking, taking photos, circling the place with a sledgehammer. I was convinced it was more than a prank. The police said they'd patrol the area more frequently for a while, but nothing else ever came of it. Sometimes, I suspect it was a wanderer or a would-be burglar who realized I was still awake and decided to scare me. But honestly, your guess is as good as mine. After that, I refused to stay home alone at night for a long time. I'd make sure my brother stayed home if my parents went out, or I'd go to a friend's place. I was on edge any time the sun went down, peering at the windows, jumping at every unexpected noise. Over time, the memory became less raw, but I can still feel that old fear in my stomach when I think about those smacks against the window, that lonely crunch of footprints in the snow, and the dreadful moment I realized someone was outside, watching. It all taught me to take any strange noise seriously, because sometimes it's not just your imagination. Sometimes someone really is out there in the dark, waiting for you to lower your guard.